Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our program today. We're delighted that we have Harold Jarche here from actually New Brunswick, Canada. He is a networking and international educational person working with lots of different groups and organizations in business management around new ways to work, working differently. So we're delighted he's here today, and we're delighted that everyone here has joined. We are going to listen to Harold today talk about educational leadership, connected leadership in a world of perpetual beta. And with that, Harold?
Thanks very much, Dan. Really appreciate it. Okay, in the back, I'll see if I can make sure I project my voice. Hi to everybody online. First of all, just a little bit of background on this is that Dan is making available some of my ebooks, and one of the ebooks is specific to leadership. It's called Adapting to Perpetual Beta, and so a lot of the concepts that I'm going to be discussing today are in that. So if you want to dig deeper on this, then by all means, please do so. Excuse me. If you want to connect with me online or find out who I am, you can see there's my Twitter handle as well as my website, and you can see what I've done, where I've gone. Now, for anybody who wasn't at the presentation on Monday, I'll just sort of do a quick overview of where I come from. And so I've been freelancing for the last 13 years. During that time, I've been very interested in what I call the network era shift, in that as we move from sort of a post-industrial information age into this 3 billion people connected together on the internet, and what digital networks are doing to society, to business, and to education. I put my ideas together. I've been blogging for a long time, and after I did about 10 years of blogging, I put together my first book called Seeking Perpetual Beta, and it looked at those general ideas and themes. I then produced another one about 6 months later, but during that time I had a lot of conversations with people, and my own area of interest was shifting a little bit, and it was all around the notion of, if the fundamental way that we organize is changing, what does that mean to leadership and what we think that leadership means? Right, so that's the general premise of what I'm going to talk about today. And by all means, we're a nice small group here, so if anybody wants to jump in or digress a little bit or anything like that, we can do that as well. This is one of what I think are one of the most important frameworks that I've come across in several years. It's called the TiMN Framework, and it was developed by David Ronfelt when he worked at the Rand Corporation. Started in the 1990s. He's published a little bit on it, and he's promising me that he's going to publish some more on it. We have conversations back and forth on that. But basically what David has put forth is that as humans, we have organized in 3 going on 4 different ways. So that when you take a look at societies, is the first way that we organized were as tribes, right? And that the tribal society had its own form. And then at a certain point in time, institutions came along. And because of that, we organized differently. And then later on, it was markets. And now we're shifting into this network era. So for example, you take a look at tribal organizations. If you look at European history, is that about the time of that we developed the written word, right? We started organizing in more restricted ways. And a couple of things that happened during that time. One was that is that you started getting more power from kings and rulers. The reason for that was that the king could write down his directions, and then that could be sent out and distributed. So suddenly the technology enabled this more hierarchical, institutionalized system. And if you look at the 3 major religions in the world, the religions of the book, the Abrahamic religions, is that they all kind of came out, right? You look at something like the Christian Bible, and it says, in the beginning was the Word, right? Well, the Word was a control mechanism, was a way in which there was only one word, right? It was, so everything could be codified. And so with the written word, we started seeing codified structures, particularly the military, government, and religion. Now, And at that time, what was interesting is that people were even fighting that. They were talking about the good old days. So if you get a case of Plato, so Plato was Socrates' student, and we don't know, we have no record of what Socrates said because, of course, Socrates was of the oral tradition, and Plato was the first of the written tradition. So Plato wrote what Socrates said according to Plato. But according to Plato, is that in one of his books called Phaedrus, is that he was talking about Socrates, and he was saying that the great master, when he looked at these written words and put down in books, and he said that men filled not with wisdom, but the conceit of wisdom will be a burden on their fellow humans with this written knowledge, right? Because this New Tech stuff, man, it was like, there's a real problem. So you're seeing, what's interesting is that the similar issues that we're seeing in this shift happened at the first shift, going from a tribal to an institutional society. Now you notice that there's a plus on those, T plus I, so that we never lose the old forms. We still have tribal traditions, right? But when you go to what David calls a bi-form, that was tribal plus institutional. And that we moved to tribal plus institutional plus markets. Okay, so markets suddenly became the dominant way in which we organize, and we're sort of at the end of that. I mean, you can't say that markets don't dominate what's going on. I mean, the Canadian dollar just lost 30% in the last 6 months. It wasn't because Canadians suddenly got lazy, right? It was just because the way that markets actually have that direct impact on us, right? And the market era came along with the age of print. So print comes along, so Gutenberg invents the printing press, and what do we get? We get a shift in how society is organized. As print comes along, one of the first things that were printed other than leaflets became the Bible, and the Bible was printed in the vernacular, in the local language. And what did that do? People all of a sudden started questioning the established institution. And so what do we get in Europe is that we get 150, 200 years of bloodshed and the religious wars as we shift into this new type of society. What comes out of that, taking us almost 300 years, is the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. Why? Because now we have books, we can share knowledge a lot easier, and suddenly to be learned is somebody who has a library and has read lots of books. And Socrates is rolling over in his grave. And that my premise is that, so the communication shifts, that's my idea. The four forms, that comes from David, is that we are now moving into an era where networks are beginning to dominate. Right? And that, my suggestion is that it's a result of the electric age. So that we started getting electrification of knowledge with the telegraph. And then that developed on to the radio, to television, and then to the internet, and kind of where we are right now with 3 billion people connected amongst themselves. And that as this becomes the dominant communications medium, is that society is changing. But the thing is that we don't have the network structures yet. We're at an interesting period where we have these institutional and market structures that existed for what's known as this triform era, and what are we going to do for the quadriform era is what he calls it, so the T plus I plus M plus N. This is the thing that is impacting every single organization, every single institution, every single country. It is this tension and not having good alternative models, because we're still working on them, is what is influencing your presidential election. Nobody is happy with current institutions, so all of a sudden the fringe candidates get much more importance. We're seeing that everywhere. Name one institution that most people have faith in. Is it the church? Is it the banks? Is it government? For the most part, they are not equipped to be in a quadriform society. Right? So the challenge for us, and for this generation and for the next generation, is that how does our society shift into this quadriform, and what are the new ways of organizing? And we're starting to see some interesting examples of that. Occupy Wall Street is one, right? Alternative ways of doing it. You're starting to see the sharing economy, not the Uber sharing economy, but the local sharing economy. You're starting to see local markets, people organizing in different ways, people trading as opposed to using money, people using local currencies, using things like Bitcoin, which is based on blockchain technology. What's interesting about that means that no central bank can control the supply of money using Bitcoin. That's the big shift, right? So that means that governments no longer can control monetary policy, right? These are big, big shifts. They're big shifts in power, and a lot of people are fighting it. I think that in the long run, we're going to figure this out. The question is that are we going to go through the equivalent of the religious wars in Europe with lots of bloodshed, or are we going to figure out how to organize as networks? I think this is the big challenge that we have. So when we look at the four forms, is that you see the arrow here, and this is kind of the way that I see the way that we've moved, is that we've moved from small scale to large scale. So in tribes, which were small scale and mostly cooperative, and as you can see, I define cooperative as different from collaborative. Cooperative is giving freely and getting back not directly in return. Being cooperative means that working the common pasture, right, not just for your maximization or for this crop, but for the long term. Right? And whereas collaborative is where you're actually working together where somebody is directing it. So we move from mostly cooperation in these dispersed tribes to the dominance of collaboration at the small scale level with institutions in a hierarchy. You are your position and stuff like that. And that for the past, we're talking a long time, over 1,000 years, collaboration has been the dominant way in which we get work done. Right? That's the way that we organize. It's the way we get stuff done, even in markets. It's collaborative, but it's also based on competition. And we're shifting with networks back to cooperation dominates, right? And that means is that it's not just getting your things done, but it's actually giving freely. And I'll give you an example of that in a second. If you take a look at how power or influence is exerted, that in tribes it was mostly through kinship. If you were the chief's son or daughter, that was a good thing, and that's how you could continue on that way, right? It was very much who you're related to, the strength of your family, and what they could do, right? In institutions, it's your position in the hierarchy. In markets, it's your ability to dominate and compete. But in networks, it's your reputation. So it's retrieving certain aspects of that older type of tribal society, and we're starting to see that now in the network. And I'm an example myself is that I became a freelancer through no choice of my own, I guess. I lost my job. I was working for a .com, and I live in a small place. I live in Sackville, New Brunswick, Canada, population 5,000. And so in 2003, I suddenly found myself unemployed. 2 young children at home and a stay-at-home mother, wife. And it was trying to figure out how am I actually going to continue doing this work I'm interested in, because I was interested in technology, education, leadership, management, those kinds of things. And one of the things I did is I started blogging. And by giving freely to what in those days was called the blogosphere, and giving freely to the web, I was able to build up a reputation. And so 13 years later, now I find myself, here I am in Nebraska. Last year I was speaking in South Africa. I speak and I work in Australia. I have clients pretty well all over the world. And it's not because, I'm a professor at some fancy institute or I'm with a big consulting company or anything like that. It's because I have built a reputation. And the way that I built that reputation, right, was just by contributing out there, writing good blog posts, putting up podcasts, those kinds of things. And because of that, people linked to me, and I built a reputation because of it. That would have been impossible 20 years ago. Why? Because we didn't have the technology to do that cheap and easy. Right? I would have had to have gone to a bigger city, worked for a large corporation probably, and tried to work my way up the institution so that we could compete in the market. So So those are my, my premises, my theses, and I'm willing to debate, argue those ones, or examine them deeper. Right? We are moving from what has been predominantly collaborative types of work, right, focused on getting the job done, to now going back to things a little bit sort of looser because we're working in a more complex type of environment, and we're moving from small-scale cooperation of kinship to large-scale to what Marshall McLuhan called the global village. Right? And I'm sure that many of you, particularly if you're working in research or academics, is that you probably have networks of people beyond this institution. So you take a look at the way that we're working from the old way to the new way, is that the core ideas of the old economy were tangible goods, good practices, and standardization, right? You see that? We have jobs, we have job descriptions, we have practices, we have policies, we have procedures, and all that, right? And that's the way that most, and it's a given that anybody who works in management goes, yeah, that's pretty well where it is. But we're moving to an economy of intangible value, intangible services. Standard & Poor's Index 1975 was about 80% tangible goods on the S&P 500. Today, it's about 15%. It's completely switched from 75 to 2015, 16. Right? Dominant technology for the past 100 and some years has been the factory and the idea of mass production, right? You design once, build many. Now with the internet, it's mass customization. Is that I want it my way, right? I want to have the blue one with the green thing on it, and this, and I want to have things, and I want to, like everybody. I'm sure that most people here have a smartphone. Is that if you pick that up, I bet you everybody would have a different set of apps on that. That's mass customization. I can put in the apps that I want, right? And we don't even think about it anymore. But that's, again, the dominant, that's what we're moving to. The notion of emergent practices, right, is as things become complex, you can't determine what's the best way to do things. You actually have to try things out. Google did this with Gmail, right? Gmail came out, it was in beta. It was in beta for, I don't even know if it was 10 years, but it was many, many years. Why? Because when they put it out, and let's say they had 100,000 or 200,000 users, they didn't know what that was going to be like with 5 million, 10 million, 100 million, a billion users. What's going to happen? So they actually had to put it out there kind of half-baked and that learn by actually engaging with the system. And that's the thing is that with complex systems is that you don't understand them unless you engage with them. You can't plan and analyze, come up with a 5-year plan, and that's what we're going to do. You have to be immersed in it. John Seely Brown says it very interestingly. He says that to understand a complex adaptive system, you have to marinate in it. You have to actually be in it. You have to be, to understand a culture, you have to be in a culture. So we're moving to mass customization. Our organizational model, we're seeing that already in a lot of different fields. We're moving from centralized, fixed, this is an institution, we have buildings and everything like that, to this decentralized model. More and more of that happening. We're seeing organizations like, you get there's a company called Automatic. They're the folks who build the WordPress technology. They run the open source code on that. And Automatic is completely virtual. Right? They have people all over the world. They don't really, I think they have an official office, but nobody works there. Right? Knowledge distribution. So does anybody know where the first business school was? So it was the Sloan School of Management, right, at MIT. And who was Alfred Sloan? He was the general manager of General Motors, right, or the chairman of the board. And the deal is that as GM was growing, right, is that they were hiring middle managers like crazy. They needed people to run this complicated system, right? And so they needed to be trained for that. So GM basically went to MIT and they said, we need to train these folks, and hence the first business degree started coming out. And now there are very few schools that don't have a business degree. The MBA is that's mid-career, you go back, you get your MBA, and then so that you can be a better manager, right? If you read folks like Henry Mintzberg, who he's at the Mintzberg School at McGill University in Canada, and he's been in this business for a long time. Henry, says that, for the most part, the business programs are totally useless. He says that we're going about this all the wrong way. Yes, if you look at people who are at the edge in the new economy, they're not going to get an MBA, right? I don't think Mark Zuckerberg has an MBA, right? And he's doing okay, right? What are they doing? They're connecting with network professional communities. And more, that's what you're seeing. You're seeing these informal network communities. What's that going to look like when we become this quadriform, fully functioning society, T plus I plus M plus N? Is that probably most people, most professionals are going to be members of some kind of a loose, informal, perhaps, distributed community. I belong to several already, and that's where I get most of my professional development. And then the business ideology has shifted from scientific management. If you're familiar with the work of Frederick Winslow Taylor, he wrote The Principles of Scientific Management in 1911. I'll go through them a little bit later. And not much has changed since 1911. And now we're moving towards more of a network management model. And that is the question about how does leadership change? If it's network management that's going to be the most effective. So we take a look at one of the things I talk about is complexity is increasing. Why is complexity increasing? Well, when you connect everybody to everybody else, that makes you've got way more alternatives and options, and stuff can happen, right? And things happen very, very fast. It's like there was a woman who wrote this not very nice post on Twitter just as she was jumping on the airplane to go to South Africa, and it was about HIV/AIDS, and she made a pretty racist comment. It was just a tweet, no big deal. Got on the plane, flew to South Africa. By the time she got there, it's a 15-hour flight is long. By the time she got there, she'd lost her job, and basically half the world hated her because the whole Twitterverse, as they call it, had erupted. Because she was well known enough that all of a sudden all this anger boiled up, and out of a job and everything like that. That's how quick things can happen when you connect 3 billion people together. We're going to have even more connected soon. So as complexity increases, you take a look at the business value. What is it that we're creating? Is that look at coordination, collaboration, and cooperation. So coordination is just making sure things are connected together, right? And that's something that computers can do fairly well. Is that business value, complexity, we need to coordinate. As it gets more and more complex, we need to collaborate, right? But now, as we are extending that level of complexity of what we're dealing with, is that we need to cooperate based upon the 3 values of our organizations need to be open, they need to be transparent, they need to be diverse. And I'll talk about those a little bit in detail as well. So this is the challenge. The challenge is putting these systems in place and being able to work with in the new way. So cooperation is a very different way of working. Right? That's a non-directive way. It's building up your reputation, it's influencing through many of these soft skills. So we look at as complexity goes, you start at the bottom here, is that when it's low complexity, we can have hierarchies, right? We can have one person in charge. We can do all that kind of stuff, right? We can develop best practices, and we can coordinate what's going on. For the most part, like the Roman legions, right? They were able to do that. The complexity level was fairly low. A maniple knew what he had to do, a centurion did, and everybody else, and they were able to get stuff done. And it could be hierarchical, and it could be autocratic. As you increase that to a medium level, which is kind of where we are today, is that the organizational structure is based on competition and levels of control. Are there control practices here? Right? Well, of course. Has anybody ever filled out an expense claim? Right? There's a control practice, and you've got all these other kinds of things, hiring boards, et cetera, right? And they're based on good practices. Well, what's this university doing? What's that university doing? What are they doing over there? And there's like a standardized general practice. And it's what many of our disciplines are based on, human resources. They're based on these good, that's what you learn. That's what you learn at MBA school, the good practices of how to do this kind of stuff, right? And the group work, for the most part, is collaborative. Collaborative means that there is somebody in charge. Someone has given the objective, the mission to do, and the rest of us work together, right? And that's why for probably the last, as long as I've been in business and as long as I've been in any organization, teamwork is so important. It's all about teamwork, right? But a team has a coach, and has a team captain and things like that, right? Somebody's in charge. Teamwork is not quite the same as a whole bunch of like-minded folks kind of figuring things out. And that, is the messy nature of democracy. And that as things get more complicated or complex, right, as anything that was down here in the medium and the low level is being eaten up by software, right? You don't apply for a mortgage anymore, you go and you press a button, right? There's a whole bunch of things, you order things online, you don't talk to a human being. It keeps going. Software is dealing, anything which we can create rules and procedures for, software is dealing with it. So the only thing left for human work is complex or creative. Right? And so our organizations, to be able to deal with that, have to be more networked and have to be more democratic, because democracy is the way in which we can enable a faster flow of information without bottlenecks. There's a saying by I think it's Jay Gilmore who said it, is that the internet sees censorship, sees any block as censorship and routes around it. Right? So the thing is that if you become, I'm controlling the information, well, what are you going to do? You're going to go around it, right? And we can do that now. We have the tools and the ways to go around anybody who's blocking information flow. That's happening inside and outside organizations. And the work practice is that we need to develop emergent practices. What worked yesterday won't work tomorrow. So we have to be constantly engaging the network, like what's the situation right now here in Nebraska with the students, but things have changed, the industry has gone up, industry's gone down, we got some people are working, some who are not, the demands of generation X, Y, Z, I'm not too sure who's next on that, right? And to do our work, we have to be more and more cooperative. We have to be engaging with, it's not just engaging with stakeholders, it's that those stakeholders become part of our network and how we actually get things done. And for the most part, we don't have the tools, techniques, and processes to do it. This is a big challenge for professionals and organizations. So anybody who was at my presentation on Monday, you saw this, right? ClueTrain Manifesto. So in the ClueTrain Manifesto, one of the premises, one of the theses, is that hyperlinks subvert hierarchy. We're seeing that. And that, you look at the example of my own case, is that there are three things that's happening with the internet, right? Is that we're getting unlimited information. It's not a problem of getting access to information, it's more a problem of filtering things. Clay Shirky says, it's not information overload, it's filter failure. So that's a completely different way. All of our institutions of education are based upon information scarcity, right? Is that you come to the university to get the information. But you know what? There's more information outside the university. Why do I have to go to the university to do this? And the same thing with the ability to self-publish. The reason I am where I am is because I was able to write a blog. People thought it was interesting, but the cost of my blog was very, very low. I would not have been able to do that if it had been 1993 and not 2003 when I became a freelancer. And then finally, ridiculously easy group forming. Anybody can get together on any issue whatsoever at any time. So that, probably the best example are, you're diagnosed with some form of cancer. What's one of the first things you do is you go online, check things out, and actually you probably find a support group somewhere online for your specific form of cancer. Why? Because there's a need. People need to connect, they need to share knowledge, and it's there. And guess what? It's as simple as creating a Facebook group. So we have this ridiculously easy group forming that Seb Paquette talks about. So this is based on network theory, the examination. So this isn't my research, I've just put it together, is that a network that is functioning well, a knowledge network, is based upon openness, transparency, and diversity of ideas, right? And so I put forth that openness, you need to be open first, and that then enables the transparency so people can see what's going on. That then fosters more diverse ideas, which reinforces the notion of openness, and from that, trust emerges and people share more, right? Because it's open, because I'm encouraged to do this, because I'm getting new ideas. And we see this on the open web a lot, right? People are sharing ideas frequently, and that's when we have it, you see it in academia with all the public access journals, right? They're open, they're transparent, and now what we're seeing is this emerging diversity of ideas. And so the knowledge flows and the trust emerges. According to Verna Ali, who's looked a lot at value networks, and that's what we're going to do in the lab afterwards, is that she recommends that in this type of a complex environment, is that what we need are loose hierarchies and strong networks. Think about that. So that means is that, and it's what I call temporary negotiated hierarchies. So when professionals in the network environment get together, they need to, sometimes you have to do something, you have to get work done, right? And that case is that you establish a temporary hierarchy. Okay, Harold, you're in charge. That never happens with me, but, and then then we get the job done, and then we go our own way, and then maybe I get together with another different group. So I'm moving between as a network person, but from time to time, we have to sort of coalesce and do things as a hierarchy, but it's a loose hierarchy. One day I'm the manager, the next day I'm the client, the next day I'm helping somebody out. And that's that space, so you're no longer your title, you are more and more your role within these temporary types of work groups that we're seeing as they're coming together and going apart. And as I showed in my presentation on Monday, you're looking at the lifespan of companies that in the 1970s, you know, the Fortune 500 companies had an average age of 60 years, and now we're getting down to like 10 to 15 years for Fortune 500 companies. So the thing is that the companies come and go much faster. We're living longer for the most part, and so we're going to be negotiating these different types of hierarchies. So this is a network in balance: openness, transparency, diversity. The way I see it is that, so what is open? Well, social networks, when we look at particularly online social networks, are by their nature an open type of structure. It doesn't matter which social network you're looking at, and that basically means that anybody can join, right? And anybody can connect to anybody else that they want to. That's the nature of the openness. So so if you're looking at, well, how can we be more open? Well, if you structure things as a social network, as an online social network, whether that's an enterprise or whether you're using something like Facebook or whatever, is that if you structure on that model, you don't have to control access, right? People decide who they connect to. Oh, you're interesting, you're talking about interesting stuff. I'm going to connect with you here and maybe we can share some stuff, right? That then enables the transparency so that we can share knowledge faster. I have a problem, I have something I'm interested in. Because I'm in a social network, it's very easy for me to connect to somebody else who's sharing the knowledge, and we can do this knowledge sharing back and forth. It's transparent and other people can see it as well, right? Which then fosters this diversity of ideas, ergo innovation. The more things that we try out, the more innovative we can become, right? So it's like what we've done is kind of like we've created this greenhouse, right? Is that we've jacked up the temperature, and you know things are moving a lot faster in that, and things are growing faster, and the bugs are growing faster too. But we've basically just sped up what used to be the sort of analog, directed, hierarchical type of a structure. Is that now things are buzzing super fast. And this is the environment that more and more of us are going to be working in. And if you're a manager, a supervisor, or someone who's helping to shape these structures, is that when you think about it, is that what should you be doing? Support and reinforce these social networks, right? So that we can share knowledge better, so we can figure out what the heck it is we're going to do with these new emerging complex problems and issues. Anybody know what these are? This is the skill testing part. Pardon me? Soft skills? Competencies. Can everybody read them or not? Can you see them? Aggressive, analytical, resilient, reasonable, communicative, passionate, selfless, empathetic, resilient. What these were actually were two sets of questions were asked to two different people. One set of question was, can you, taking a look at this list of words, which of these words are more feminine or more masculine? Okay, and a number of people did that. Okay, that one's more feminine, that one's more masculine. Okay, you can probably figure out which ones those are. And then the next question was asked to a different group of people. Which of these attributes are more important for leaders? And the survey says so feminine traits were more likely to be linked to leadership. This is what's emerging in the network era. What, predominantly masculine ways of leadership, being confident, directive. You see the words up there. What do we got? Aggressive, proud, analytical, decisive. You know, you probably still see that in job descriptions. Independent, resilient, right? As opposed to empathetic. Empathy is now seen as an important leadership skill. Was it 50 years ago? Probably not. If you surveyed a bunch of men, I'm sure I know what they would have said, right? So this shows us, you know, people realize what's happening, whether they know exactly what it is or whether they can articulate it or not. But this is what we're seeing as a shift in our perceptions of what is leadership. So if these feminine traits are seen as important, what does that mean for our own practice? You know, and what does that mean for our organizations and our institutions? All of this will be made available too, and we'll have Dan will make these available, so if you need to look at these things. So remember I talked about network management, talked about Frederick Winslow Taylor's work on the principles of scientific management. There we go. Is that legible? So Frederick Winslow Taylor in 1911 wrote the Principles of Scientific Management. They were based on how much coal a man could shovel. But I mean, read that. Now you think about that with these traits of leadership today, right? Only through the enforced standardization of methods, the enforced adoption of the best implements and working conditions, and the enforced cooperation, not my definition of cooperation, that this faster work can be assured, right? And the duty of enforcing the adoption of standards and enforcing this cooperation rests with management alone. Management is in charge. This is taken directly from the Principles of Scientific Management, which have informed our business schools and leadership for the past 100 years. Whereas if you take a look at, I played with this, and let me just open that up a little bit bigger. There we are. What I call Principles of Network Management. So I just took his words and twisted them a bit for the 21st century. So what I'm saying is that within the greater context of willing cooperation as I define it, and being able to select our own tools to get the work done, and quite often select where we're going to do the work, and that through knowledge sharing, can we do this more transparent work so that we can innovate, adapt, do things faster and better, quicker, and deal with more and more complex issues. Any comments on that? And in the books, if you want to read a little bit deeper on that, you can do that. So basically what we're seeing here now at the beginning of this, or midway through this network era, is that we're flipping the traditional hierarchy, the traditional pyramid, so that instead of, you know, men shoveling coal at the bottom, is that really what we have is we have network contributors of knowledge workers, right? And that those network contributors, right, have to work in a transparent, diverse, and open environment. And that servant leaders at the bottom are pulling down and they're listening actively, they're questioning the context, they're sensing, reviewing, and seeing what's going on, right? And then their job becomes one of suggesting responses as opposed to the enforced standardization, helping to build consensus, and proposing changes. Those are more those feminine types of leadership attributes. So this is the model of how work gets done. Because the thing is that you say, well, we don't have to do that. We're going to run things the way that they are. Well, when the rest of the world outside is doing this stuff, right, it's going to happen inside. I gave a presentation to senior public servants in Canada several years ago, and I asked the question, I said, when your citizens outside your organization can get information faster, can get decisions made, can find out what they need, can connect with others faster than they can if they talk to you or you can inside. How relevant is your organization, your ministry, your department going to be to society? So it becomes a question of relevance, and that's why we're questioning our institutions and our organizations and even our markets, because they're not acting like networks. And we're starting to get that, we're starting to understand what it's like to be in a network, where I can put up a bunch of YouTube videos, and next thing I know, I'm a star. I didn't have an agent, right? Bang, I'm out there and I'm known, right? And we're seeing that more and more. Is that, and of course the young people see this much better than the old people do, because we've seen the old way of doing things for much too long. Who's never heard of Marshall McLuhan? Tell the truth. Okay, good. Okay, so Harold Innes and Marshall McLuhan. Harold Innes was older than Marshall McLuhan. Both taught at the University of Toronto back in the 50s and 60s. And Marshall McLuhan became actually a bit of like a TV star at the time, because he was talking about, he was able to sort of translate a lot of the work that Harold had done around communication. And the term, the medium is the message, the global village, those are things that come from Marshall McLuhan. There's lots of McLuhanisms. And it's interesting, does anybody catch the typo in the book? Can you read that or not? Yeah? What's the typo?
Massage.
Yes, the medium is the massage, right? It was a typo, right? But Marshall saw this and he said, this is perfect, because that's exactly it. The medium massages us and changes us, right? It actually influences what happens. And Marshall, working with his son Eric in the 1980s, developed what are known as the laws of media. And this, in the top right here, you see what's called the media tetrad, right? It's got 4 components to it. So basically, is that every technology, right, that humans use has 4 effects. It extends some capability, it obsolesces an older capability, and quite often turning that older capability into a luxury good or a niche product. It retrieves something from a previous age, and when pushed to its furthest extreme, it reverses the original tendencies that it enhanced. Take a look at the automobile. So the automobile extended the foot and human transportation, right? You got the automobile and you're able to go many, many places. What did it obsolesce? The horse and carriage. So owning horses and having a carriage now becomes very much a luxury type of thing. Only the rich can afford them. Before, everybody had a horse, or most people did, right? What does it retrieve? Retrieve something from the past. And as a cyclist, I can tell you this because I don't own a car, and so I deal with cars from the outside only. And it retrieves the knight in shining armor. It retrieves the notion of being armored and nothing can bother me outside, right? So off I go, I have my car, and I can go wherever I want and quite often ignore what's going on around me, particularly cyclists. And it reverses. What does it reverse? Well, when everybody gets a car, all that mobility becomes gridlock, becomes traffic jams, right? And so that's an example of one. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to run over a few of them, because I think that the book McLuhan for Managers actually is quite good. Unfortunately, it's not in print. You'll have to find it in a used book or Abe Books or something like that. But I think it's very good, because what the authors have done is that they have taken the work of McLuhan and created some very practical, pragmatic advice to look at problems, particularly using the media tetrad. Okay, so this is the tetrads according to Harold, and any feedback appreciated. So digital networks, which, the internet, the web, 3 billion people connected, extend humanity. I can understand people better. I know people all over the world. I understand them because I talk to them, and that without an intermediary. So there's the potential to expand our humanity and our sense of community. I'm no longer Harold in Sackville. I'm now, I know what's going on in Africa. I know what's happening, and I have personal relationships there. It obsolesces the markets and the institutions, right? That's the whole notion of TiMN. So it's obsolescing, financial markets may be obsolesced by blockchain technology. We're not sure. Again, we're kind of in that fuzzy era. It retrieves kinship. So again, the notion of the global village, right? This kinship, and anybody who's been on Twitter for a long time or other media know that there are people that you've never met, but you have this notion of kinship with them. Why? Because you touch each other all the time. Little things here, little things there, and you bond. And it reverses potentially into a popularity contest, so that the person with the most followers suddenly, can turn that into money, or they get more media attention or things like that, or their cred score or their clout score, or one of these other ridiculous scores, is now used in talent management and in recruiting. And we see that, is that recruiters go and they take a look at your LinkedIn profile, and if you don't have enough connections or enough, check marks on how wonderful you are, they ignore you. But in a lot of cases, those are meaningless. That's society. What about communications? Okay. So the networks extend listening and speaking. That's what I'm doing right now, is that we're using digital networks. I'm being live streamed and recorded so that people who are here, I'm now extending that out to a much larger audience, right? So that they enable that, and really, this is no longer rocket science. Obsolescence is the whole notion of expertise. Who's the expert when the network knows more? And we're seeing that a lot right now, is that the one expert, you may be an expert in your field, but if you're not on the web, nobody knows that you exist. That becomes an issue as well. It retrieves storytelling, and I think that your President Obama probably is an interesting example of that. Is that I think part of his popularity was he's able to he's a very good orator, and in this age of sound bites and things getting out digitally, that becomes important. I think perhaps some of your presidential candidates as well are telling stories that resonate with people or with certain aspects of the population, and then it reverses into this whole notion of false narratives. Right? It's quite easy to get this false narrative going, right? It's easy to say that weapons of mass destruction, right? And there was a narrative built around that, and it got out to a whole bunch of different sources all over the place, right? And this narrative went through, and we have all kinds of these that later we find out they're false narratives. That's because we have the ability to manipulate these networks. Right, the people who understand them. Okay, you plant somebody on Twitter and somebody else here, and you plant this story, and all of a sudden the network just goes, it's like a virus, right? So communication is shifting. What about work? Okay, digital networks extend productivity. I mean, you take a look at the productivity that one person has with a laptop computer and an internet connection. This is stuff that we didn't have. I remember when a content management system, which is now the equivalent of WordPress.com and it's free, started at $100,000. You couldn't get anything out of that. So now so the productivity that we have is absolutely incredible. You want to do something? Google Docs. You want to try something else? Okay, we've got this calendar thing. We want to connect people together. We put everybody on Skype. We do that. The ability for us to be productive for human work is skyrocketing. It's obsolescing the whole notion of industrial type labor. Right? It's not my friend and colleague, Jay Cross, who passed away last year, had an interesting saying. He says, imagine, industrial or even production work. And what happens is that you go to work and you produce, and then go home. And then you do the same thing the next day. And the same thing the next day, because you're producing, and that's the way that we measure a lot of work. What about, creative work? How does that work? Well, the creative worker goes to their studio or office, and it's nothing, 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 blinding flash of insight, nothing, 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 nothing. But that blinding flash of insight was probably created more value, right, than all that production over 10, 15, 20 times. So we're measuring things. We have to measure things quite differently in this age. So that's and it retrieves the notion of artisans, right? And you're seeing that more and more. Is that you've got these, I'm the master of my own destiny. I use my own tools, and other people do as well. And now you see this amongst coders particularly, right? They're very, and they're sharing on places like GitHub. They're sharing their code so they can all up their game a little bit. All right, it's very much like the guilds of old. So we're retrieving that the artisan, I'm not just an expert, but I'm also a member of this greater community. Right? And they look out for each other. And I have that. I belong to several communities where it's like someone's looking for work, looking for some gigs. You go to your community, we self-identify and as members of this. And it's kind of like, yeah, I can help you out. Yeah, because I know that some year you might or somebody else might, but I'm giving, I'm cooperating within this guild of artisans. And then finally, the potential of all of this stuff is the reversal into the panopticon. Does anybody know what the panopticon was? Panopticon was a prison that was designed but never built, but probably exists today. And basically the way it was done, it was a British designer, 19th century, and it was a prison, and the prison was built in the round with all the cells facing into this inner courtyard. In the middle of the inner courtyard was a tower. And from the tower, the guards could see everybody everywhere. But the thing is, nobody could see what the guards were looking at. Right? So you knew that you were being watched, but you didn't know when you were being watched and who was watching you. Now, does that remind you of anything? The internet, all the tracking and things that are being going on right now. So we're already flipping towards that potential panopticon. There are people who don't say certain things on social media because they never know who's going to pick it up and what's going to happen with it. Education, probably something near or dear to your heart, right? Extends the individual, right? I can go and I can learn whatever I want. I can go to Khan Academy, I can go on Wikipedia, I can connect to experts, I can do all that kind of stuff. The obsolescence of the academy as we know it. What the new academy is going to look like, I don't know. But I think that the whole notion of the academy it is in question. You hear this all the time. Is higher education dead? Is the academy dead? All that kind of stuff. I don't know, but I know that the way it was is not the way that it's going to be. It's retrieving discourse. So actually what we're doing is that we're retrieving the age of Socrates, right? So we've lived in the age of Plato for thousands of years, right? The word, the written word, linearity, all that kind of stuff, that's all now discourse. It's all about, connecting and communicating together. It's much more verbal. And we're seeing that a lot with video, right? People are sharing video a lot more. Right? And that's the way that they're connecting with each other. And they're having these conversations in education. And then finally, it reverses it, the potential of reversing into fewer choices. As the platform monopolists, as I call them, which Udemy, Coursera, these other MOOCs, massively open online courses, start taking over, they become the only place to go. And as you start seeing them as the only place to go, what are they offering? They're offering what most of the people want. They're offering the tip of not the long tail, but the head of that. And so that's what we're seeing is the potential that's going to happen with education is that, well, we don't need the academy's gone, we're going to have all this online stuff, and next thing you know, there's one Facebook to rule social networks, right? There's nothing that competes directly with Facebook, and that's the nature of networks. We have these network effects. Once one network dominates, it's really hard for another network to compete directly with them, right? So we have one Facebook, we have one Amazon. There's a potential we're going to have one of all those kinds of things that are very big. So if you're interested in leadership in this environment, what should a leader do? We're thinking about those feminine attributes, right? Is that I think that the role of leaders in networks is to help the network make better decisions. Because if the network makes better decisions and you're a member of that networked organization, that's good for you. Right? It's kind of like my job is to keep the ship afloat, right? Because I'm on the ship. So sharing expectations, right? That's part of it, right? Is that how can you, talking about the future, talking about where things could be going. The notion of connecting people, not being a bottleneck, right? Why should everybody contact me for information when I can connect two other people together? Some people call it network weaving. The notion of conversations, because we're retrieving discourse, right? The notion of adding value to knowledge. I'm not just passing stuff on because why do I not? Because information is ubiquitous. It's unlimited almost, right? So when it comes to knowledge, right, if I'm going to be sharing it, I should be adding some value, adding some context to that. That's the role of leader, right? And say, hey, this is really good, and I think this part is pertinent for the work that you folks are doing. Let me help you out on this thing. Learning by doing. We have to all be better learners. We have to model the behavior of constantly learning. I call it life in perpetual beta. Is that if you want to promote learning, you've got to be learning, right? There's no more sitting back. Those days are over, and I'm a baby boomer, and we had it good for a long time. But I think those days are going to be over pretty soon. And then finally, initiating change. It's only by initiating change that we can see what's happening with the environment, because we have to initiate the change, try little things out, and see how that happens. So that whole notion of experimentation. We all have to have the mindset of Benjamin Franklin. You know, out there, I want to try this out, do this, try that, okay, out there, those kinds of things. And this is what I think really is where effective leaders and the leaders who are going to have the highest reputation, because in networks it's your reputation that matters, these are some of the things that they're going to be doing. Is that the best leaders are going to be engaged by networks, by networked organizations, the ones who exhibit this. So when I say yesterday, I don't mean yesterday, I mean basically, for the last 50, 100 years, is that work and education and training have been separate. Is that I go to school, I do my undergrad, I get a job perhaps, I work for a while, now I go back to school, I get my MBA, I go work for a while, pick up some training and stuff like that, but I go get me some learning, right? It's not. Now, work and learning have to be integrated. Why? Well, because there's no more one size fits all, right? Because things are changing quickly, right? So what I say is work is learning and learning is the work. And I think that for educational institutions, a key part of that is preparing students for this type of an environment. Is that it's not about passing the test, it's not about getting the marks, it's not about finishing the curriculum and then it's over. It's not that, pump and dump kind of thing that, after the exam I remember nothing. It's how can I build a network so I can continuously learn? All right, and this is the example, I gave you the example yesterday or on Tuesday, I'm confused on days, about Bangor University. And there in the psychology department, we worked with them to help build systems and structures for the students so that they could have an external network already in place so that when they graduated, they had connections outside the university. So what's the future? Okay, so I see with digital networks, right, they're extending the individual learning, and that's where I explained my framework of personal knowledge mastery. That's one way, not the only way, but that's one way in which we can take control of our learning and our professional development. It's obsolescing the academy, but the 1% or the 0.01%, they're still going to go there. I don't think Harvard or Princeton are going to close. They may change a little bit, and that'll make for an interesting difference between, the unwashed masses who are getting their stuff all over the internet, and then this smaller and smaller group of people who are getting this coaching and intimate type of academy instruction and learning. We're retrieving the discourse through social media. Right? We're getting more and more of that. The connections is just so much easier to have these conversations. And then, of course, reversing into fewer choices. There's this big discussion going on between XMOOCs and CMOOCs. Well, CMOOCs are these massively open online courses developed initially by George Siemens, Stephen Downes, and Dave Cormier, who did some of the early work on that. And these were open, and they were accessible to everybody. And they created the differentiation between those and what are called XMOOCs, which are corporate MOOCs, that's the Udacity, Coursera, and things like that, in which you basically have an organization that is working on some way to make a profit on it. The way they make the profit is that anybody can join, that's fine, it's all free, but if you want the certificate, it costs money. Right? And so it becomes just this, really what it becomes is a very cheap way to filter talent. Right? And what happens when XMOOCs are the only way and they're only offering courses that actually pertain to the corporations, the platform monopolists, or whatever other organization is trying to control the game. So we lose the democratic aspect of what the MOOCs originally were. I think that one of our big roles is, working together. I love this one. Mimi and Eunice, they're my favorite cartoons. And unfortunately, Nina Paley, who's the cartoonist, hasn't updated this for several years. And so, here, if we work together, we can figure things out. And I think that what we need as a society, particularly a democratic society, is that we need to encourage an actively engaged and aggressively intelligent citizenry that is trying to figure out how we're going to create new organizations in the network era. And that leadership is doing this ourselves, learning by doing. So all of this is like learning a new language, learning to speak the language and figure things out, and then, all right, now we actually have to step into the arena. I think that anybody who thinks that this stuff is important, we've got to be in there and we've got to be doing our part one way, and it's by connecting with other humans. We have to retrieve our humanity from all of this big data technology surround. So, thanks very much. Any questions, comments, observations, or do we want to break? Or yeah.
I was thinking about the personality traits you put forward, and one that I've kind of been thinking more and more about recently is altruism. And I didn't see that. And I just wondered if you think that something like that is, I wonder if you think that altruism might be something that has a positive role but doesn't get recognized because leaders don't necessarily value it, and it's more intangible.
Yeah, altruism isn't one. I guess altruism is a bit of a double-edged sword. Are you being altruistic or are you being selfish? Right, can always be the thing, so that you can be perceived as being altruistic. I've identified sort of three main traits for people who work, because if you look at what we wanted in people, in workers before and even now, were things like intelligence and diligence and being stick-to-itiveness, getting things done. And three that I've identified are creativity, empathy, and passion. And I think that empathy might be, so if I can empathize with my fellow humans, that maybe the altruism comes out of that. But I think that I haven't done a lot of research into altruism itself, but I mean, for me, I guess it's not even altruistic, it's more selfish, is that my research and work tells me that the best way that we can govern ourselves is in a democratic way. It's the only way in which we can deal with complex. So I'm not sure if I'm being altruistic in promoting democracy or if I'm being selfish on that, but interesting. So anybody else want to weigh in on altruism? Any altruistic people here want to jump in? No?
It's hard to find a lot of others.
Yeah. A lot of other altruists? Okay, yeah.
Well, sometimes.
Okay. Anything else? No? So.
The diagram that you showed earlier, I don't know if it was like figure 5, it was where you had the box with cooperation and collaboration down on the bottom, and then you had, that one right there. What I find very intriguing about this is that if you look at where institutions, which would be a university or is basically behind the network in terms of this flow of, so the institution called a university is well behind where things really are, if you will, in terms of the business of networking and cooperation and those sorts of things. And that, we actually we're clearly potentially being barriers to the development of networks, barriers to the development of our students to be part of networks because of this inherent need to want to maintain the institution. And then, of course, we could talk about the hierarchy within the institution and how long it takes for anything to change within the institution and how fast things are changing. The whole business of markets. I mean, to most faculty, you mention the word markets and they start to cringe because, well, this isn't a market thing. Well, yeah, it is. This is, who are you serving and who's going to come, so to speak. But again, I really, this, I mean, has a lot of stuff. in it.
Yeah, there's a lot of unpacking to do with a lot of this. I mean, but if you look at it back, just let's say the last couple hundred years, and we take a look at academic institutions, is that quite often they didn't lead. Right? Again, I used the example of Sloan. You know, it was business going to academia to say you're not meeting the needs of our workers. Now, and I know that there's this, you know, this disconnect between education and job preparation, and that's, you know, and that's in some ways it's an easy thing it's an easy out to say, well, we're not in the job preparation business, we're in the liberal arts or education and things like that, and we're teaching people to be better humans, you know, better scholars and stuff like that. At the same time, the university is advertising, if you don't have a university degree, you're going to make $20,000 a year less, right? So telling, you know, out of two different sides on there. I mean, from what I see as that, again, I think that a lot of the potential answers and some of the things are happening, some are happening inside academia, some are happening outside. I think that as a professional, so my definition of a professional is someone who's constantly pushing the edges of their discipline, right? You're constantly out there trying to get better. Is that if it's limited to inside either your discipline or your institution, you're missing out on what's happening in this network era. I think we all have to step outside of our comfort zone and the places in which where we have knowledge and we're respected, and see what's happening in different places, because we are in a significant time of change. I know it sounds trite and it sounds cliche, but I think that this is a significant shift point over this 20-year period.
The whole business of innovation and all, you know, again, being on that edge and the extent that you want to be on that edge has a lot to do with your comfort level and the whole business of being a little bit on the kind of, let's take it, be on the safe side, I think would be, or on the conservative side of things, is kind of what would describe a institution such as
But as change comes faster, and we're seeing that with cycle times, with the average lifespan of companies and things like that, is that there are very few of us who can actually afford to wait on and see what they're doing next, because what they're doing well, and I'm going to be I've worked with some companies and say we want to be fast followers. You can't follow fast enough. You actually have to be out there and test it. I'm not saying change everything that you're doing, but it's like get out there. I think Kurt Vonnegut had a great saying. He says, you know, it's only from the edges that you can see clearly. So you actually have to get out there, and that without all the noise and what McLuhan called the ground and all that, is that you have to get yourself out and see what's happening externally. And you know, and there aren't any answers in this stuff. I mean, there weren't any. I mean, if someone was standing up when the printing press came in and the religious wars were on and stuff like that, and was talking about the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, they would have said, "Yeah, you're nuts." Now the thing is that I think that shift is going to happen a lot faster, because I mean, I said for the first time ever in the history of humanity, we have 3 billion people who, for the most part, one way or another, can connect with each other without asking for permission. You know, and I think that's pretty incredible.
Harold, as I think about institutions and I think about networks and so forth, that one of the things I think we carry with us through our lives have been those opportunities we've had to learn. We've been with distinguished faculty. They were able to provide us remarkable educational discovery and so on and so forth. And that starts that inquisitive nature of the student, you know, and we go and we look for more information. But I know coming out of the extension workshop we've had the last couple of days is one of the messages there is you are the network, you need to be in the network, you need to be out there and you become an expert, but your role may change. And I wonder if you might just think a little bit with us about, in terms of institutions and so forth, that faculty role, that extension educator role, and what does that look like in moving ahead, say 5 years from now or 10 years from now? what should we be thinking about in terms of, and where I'm coming from is really that online and lifelong role in education. If you just might give some thought to that.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of expertise in universities, and that expertise is valid. But if you're an expert in your field, then you should be looking at, am I actually affecting enough people? Am I touching? Am I sharing? How am I being more of a knowledge catalyst than just the person who's delivering the knowledge, right? So quite often, instead of me always finding the answer and giving it, maybe it's me being connected to somebody else who can help with the answers or help with someone else's journey, so that it's more of a, again, I know that Chuck Hibbard's talked about it, about the no longer the sage on the stage, right? And that's a tough one when you're like, because I'm the sage on the stage right now, right? So here, and everyone's listening, and that's kind of good, right? And but how do we then move to, okay, my expertise is good, but it's not good enough, right? So how do I then, make the network stronger? How do I share that? And then the same thing with, if you're as an extension officer out in your area, is that how can I actually improve the connections that we're having? Is it maybe it's not good enough that my county or my state and that all the people know each other and stuff like that? Is it maybe I need to be connecting with other communities or putting communities together? How do I help people? Again, how do I make the network more resilient, right? Because if the network is resilient and I'm a member of that network, then the chances are that it's going to be better for me in a lot of different ways. And I know that in a lot of fields is that people have risen up in the ranks because of their independent action, and have had to compete for it too. And now we're flipping that, and I think that's a big challenge. But if you believe in anything that I've been saying here, is that particularly if you're a little bit older, then it's about time that we, the older people, started connecting the younger people so that they can help build these new structures that we're going to need. And that I don't think the university is going to disappear, but I think it's going to look differently. Well, let's help it look differently in the right way.
Harold, thank you very much.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you, everybody.